Good. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I'm pleased to see this many people interested in the 17th century. My name is Dave Weed. I'm one of the three people on the back of the brochure who've been working on this project for the last 2 years. I will explain very briefly how I got into this and then talk to you about what we've discovered in the Sowams Heritage Area, which you can see is not around Boston and not around Plymouth, okay? But this is the area down in what's called Sowams, or the southern area. I like to refer to it as the south of New England, okay? And as you can see from this map, it's about 40 miles from Plymouth, which is where most people in the public think everything happened. But we're working very hard to explain to people that really the untold story is what happened in Sowams, the area essentially between Providence and Bristol, if you've ever been to Rhode Island. How many people have been to Rhode Island? I hope you all have. Good, okay. If I were in California, I'd have a different response, right? I live in the town of Warren, and if you go through the little town of Warren, you will find Town Hall there, and if you look up at the frieze above the door, you will see incorporated the town of Warren, and look even closer, it says Sowams 1621. Well, ordinarily you'll think that the town of Warren was started in 1747, but actually the first encounter was between someone who lived here and traveled to Plymouth, who we all know as the Massasoit, because that's a title, and I'm trying to change this. Everybody calls him like that was his first name. It's like president, you know? Well, no, it's President Truman, President Eisenhower, the Massasoit Osamequin, okay? That was his given name, and the name that he used in his life from 1581 on, but most people encounter him in Plymouth. And they probably assume, I haven't done a survey, that he must have grown up and lived nearby, right? No, he lived 40 miles away. He lived in my backyard. This is the park behind my house. I don't have a pointer here, I don't think. But if you look up, see that white bandshell there? Just to the left of that, if the leaves were off the trees, you'd see my house. This is what's known as Burrs Hill Park, but it was really known in 400 years ago as Burrs Hills because this flat area you see there had been taken down when they built a railroad, which is now the bike path that goes right across where that tree line is. And the hills were removed. And in the process, Charles Carr, 1913, removed the contents of 42 grave sites in Burrs Hill because people, including the people building the railroad in 1841, were removing skeletons, but also burial items like ceramics and pipes and forks and knives and all kinds of things from the grave sites there. And Charles, who was the town librarian and an amateur archaeologist, decided that it was better if he did the rest of the removal and at least could keep those items. Of course, he then gave and sold many of the items to several other museums, Heffenreffer Brown, the Hay Museum in New York City, and his own little museum that's still there on the second floor of the George Hale Library. Well, I retired in 2017. 2 months before that happened, members of the Mashpee tribe came, having worked with the town, to get permission, and dug a hole for a 10 by 10 foot concrete crypt or vault and placed within it over 600 burial items that were taken from that same park a little over 100 years beforehand. So those items are now back underground under this monument to Osamequin, placed there by the Mashpee tribe. And you can come and visit that monument. Unfortunately, there's no other explanation, and I'm working on a National Park Service style interpretive sign for the park to help people get oriented. Going back to our maps, we run back to the native designations of this territory before the English colonists arrived, and we look at the portion of this area that was the Pokanoket Land. Nearly everyone I know knows this area as the Wampanoag, but Wampanoag was the name of the nation of various tribes. I'm glad you agree with me. Not everybody does. But if you go back to maps prior to 1700, it will say Pokanoket. The name Wampanoag didn't appear till after 1700, partly because those people who were self-identified, they didn't call themselves Pokanoket like a tribe. They were just the people, okay? But others identified the area as the Pokanoket Land, and you'll see that on many maps. But after the King Philip War, 1675-76, if you said you were Pokanoket or you spoke the language, the English had permission to shoot you on sight. So it wasn't a smart idea to identify yourselves as Pokanoket, so that name pretty much disappeared from the literature of the time. I'm working now with members of the tribe, and they want very much to bring back their original tribal name. Not every one of the native tribes agrees with that, okay? And if you know anything about Native American tribes, you know that they're as different from one another as countries are in the world, okay? So Sowams was the southern area that essentially was close to the interface between the Massachusetts, the Nipmunks, the Narragansetts, and then the Wampanoag, or otherwise Pokanoket. And this map is a little erroneous because the intersection line should be at Pokanoket Hill. If you're ever in Providence, it's the western boundary of the city of Providence, and that's where those nations would meet for council. We believe we know the place that they did that. Long before that time, clearly, there were people living in this area for 8, 10, possibly 12,000 years. If you want to go into the archaeology, there clearly are artifacts and Paleo-Indian artifacts scattered about in various places, but unfortunately, not as much as you might find in other places of the country in the interior, simply because most of the settlement during that time was along a coastline that is now well underwater. So if we ever get a reversal of climate change and the glaciers reform and then the sea level drops 10, 12 feet, we might have the opportunity to find those artifacts, but not so much today. It was the most populated area with anywhere from 70,000 to 100,000. They didn't do a census then, so it's just guesses at this point. But we do know that they lived quite successfully in that the populations had grown over a period of time pretty much to match the food supply. And from all accounts of the life of people who were native to that area was abundant and successful. And I just reference Verrazano's description in 1524 when he came into the harbor in Newport, how he described these people as very healthy, tall, robust people who had a pleasant attitude, as contrasted with the people who served on the ship that he came over on. They weren't so pleasant. But there was trading, as we know, all along for 100 years before anybody from England and actually Amsterdam came, Leiden came over in 1620. There were also attempts at colonization, at least from an economic point of view, in Virginia. But when the group that came in 1620 arrived to the Native American village of Patuxent, now known as Plymouth, they discovered essentially the evidence of a Holocaust. I liken it to if we had an atomic bomb, a Hiroshima bomb, on the coast of Massachusetts. That's what they found. Though some of the structures, the buildings, the Witus were still intact, 2,000 people had died there within a 3-year period of time. So many so that they left the bones to bake in the sun because there was no one left alive to bury the dead. So when Squanto came back from England after having grown up there, he discovered everyone he knew was gone. Well, of course, the English, in fine style, said this is a sign from God. He has prepared the way. And though life was certainly difficult for those folks, particularly during that first winter, they at least really didn't have to pay any attention in large measure to native people, because the native people who were surviving were closer to Narragansett Bay, thereby in the Sowams area. They were much less affected than people on the coastline. But at the same time, they were fearful of going back to the coast for what had happened there, fearing that the same fate might befall them. So Pilgrims had a chance to, after half of them died, to begin to eke out an existence there on the coast. And until, March 21st, that's just about the anniversary coming up here, when the Massasoit arrives with 60 of his warriors and offers an opportunity to meet, and sits down and hammers out the Wampanoag Treaty. Anybody heard of the Wampanoag Treaty? This is a history camp. You all should have heard of it, but guess what? Nobody tells you anything about it. We hear certainly about the Mayflower Compact. That gets a lot of press. But the Wampanoag Treaty was a very important treaty that occurred after this meeting, which is always delightfully shown in illustrations. I'm certain it wasn't quite as picturesque as that. However, this is the Wampanoag Treaty, and it basically said, we won't harm you, you won't harm us. If somebody threatens to harm you, we'll help protect you, and vice versa. Okay? Not a complicated treaty, but pretty clear in terms of what was going to happen. Why would the Massasoit, who was chief of chiefs over 61 tribes, agree to such a thing? Well, first of all, he had lost a huge portion of his own people. Secondly, the Narragansetts, who were their arch enemies, at least at that time period, and who were interested in moving from, if you will, western Rhode Island today, into the Sowams Heritage Area and all the abundance in terms of food and access to the water, et cetera, he feared that they would do that if he didn't ally with the Pilgrims, because even though they were few in number, they had guns and cannons, okay? And to some degree, this idea that they must know something about what killed everybody there. I know nobody knew about germs and things of that sort, but they at least had a sense that they had a power that might be helpful against the Narragansetts. So this treaty that was hammered out in 1621 is actually signed. They met first on March 21st, then they came back on April Fool's Day, April 1st, and signed that agreement. It took them some time, of course, to pen this agreement, but then the Massasoit signed that agreement, and this remained in effect for at least 40 years till the Massasoit passed away in their many accounts, 1660, 61, or 62. I'd go with 1660. So 40 years of peaceful relations. Unless somebody can correct me, I don't believe anything like that happened anywhere along the East Coast in the 17th century. Certainly not in Virginia. And this was a golden opportunity for the English to not only survive but prosper, because they basically had the protection and knowledge base of the native population, which meant that they could gain the information they needed to raise their own crops, hunt and fish successfully, and navigate the trails and the area throughout the region. This, by the way, is the only evidence that I've seen that the United States government has ever acknowledged the Wampanoag Treaty, so-called. I would call it the Pokanoket Treaty, but in any case, you all heard of the Sacagawea coin. If you turn it over, this is on the other side. Ah, okay. So you probably already have one, and you never looked at it, right? Okay, gotcha. I understand. So here's Ed Winslow, obviously a leader, not the governor in Plymouth, but somebody who really helped speak for and translate through translators to Massasoit and his people. In 1621, July, after this treaty was signed, he decides, well, I'm going to go pay him a visit. So he and Hampton and Habomanek, the native guide, walked the 40-some miles from Plymouth down to what was called Sowams, or basically Massasoit's home, if you will. There are many competing theories as to where that is. If you live in Warren, it was, of course, in Warren. It's on our town hall. If, however, you live in Barrington and follow Thomas Bicknell, it must have been in Barrington. And there are wonderful arguments on both sides about where it was. Frankly, it doesn't really matter. As we know, Native people rarely stayed in one place for long periods of time and would move to their winter camp and other places, et cetera. So it's safe to say that the Massasoit lived in the Bristol, Warren, Barrington area, okay? Close enough because there's a spring right there on the end of Baker Street in Warren that says the Massasoit Spring. So that must be where he lived, right? And if you're a Virginia Baker adherent, that's what you'll say. Of course, you can go across the river and look at the Massasoit Spring in Barrington as well. The truth of the matter is there are probably 30 springs in the area. Okay, so it doesn't nail it there. So not only did our good friend Ed Winslow come down in 21, 2 years later at least, we don't know if he made any other visits, but he, in Mort's Relation, makes this wonderful multi-page description of his visit and his travels there and what happened. It's absolutely worth a read if you haven't had a chance to do that. But he hears that the Massasoit is deathly ill, and he wants to go down there and see him before he passes. So they take the 2-day journey down there. By the way, it was a 2-day journey if you were an English colonist, even with a guide. But if you were a native warrior, you could make that trip and back in 1 day, okay? They were that good in terms of their running abilities. So in 23, he comes down, and he also has heard that there's a Dutch trading ship there, another reason to show up. Unfortunately, he doesn't make it in time. The Dutch trading ship leaves. He was also informed that the Massasoit had died, only to learn a few hours later that he was still alive. He visits him in his Ritu there, finds him on his deathbed, surrounded by his family and supporters and tribe members, and does the one thing that any good English leader did at the time. You treat the person for their illness. They had no doctors. If you were an English leader, you were the doctor. And he administered the best medicine he knew how. He even had ordered chicken soup at one point, but they never got to that. But miraculously, the Massasoit recovers. He recovers his eyesight. I won't go into all the details about his bowels, but everything gets better, let's put it that way. And they cemented their friendship for the rest of their lives, okay? So if the treaty weren't enough, now the Massasoit is indebted for life to Ed Winslow. And that relationship really became the basis of the peaceful relationships from then on. So if you're ever down in Warren and Barrington, this is, you know, Tyler Point in Barrington. That's the Warren River on the right and the Barrington River on the left. Doesn't look like that today, does it? This is a Google map where I just erased the town and put in, but you will, well, how else are you going to recreate the 17th century? I'd love to have had a drone shot from then, okay? But the bottom line is, you see some treed areas, but here's Warren, which was called Brooks Pasture. This was wide open land. This was land that the English were just enthralled with. Miles Standish came down and called it the the garden of the patent, and the flower, though we spelled it F-O-U-R, of the garden, okay? So this garden was so described because of this open cleared land. And you might think, well, they didn't have steel axes, how did they clear this? Well, for centuries, they had been burning off the undergrowth and the trees, etc. And by the time the Pilgrims arrived there, that's what they saw in this Sowams or southern area, was wide swaths of open land, perfect for what? Yeah, for grazing, so they could bring their animals in, for planting, okay? Looked just like England, okay? Which had been denuded of trees by that time. So they set up a trading post. This is the Hoxie trading post on the Cape, but there is one very brief description of a trading post, probably at Tyler Point, down there at the point of the peninsula, and native people living in various clusters around the area. Here's Miles and his reference to the flower of the garden. Wasn't long, another 14 years, before our friend Roger Williams began his trek. You know, he started his ministry when he came over from England in Plymouth, then went up to Salem, and then you're probably roughly familiar with the fact that he didn't get along real well up there, and he was banished, notified that they were going to take him back to England, but 3 days earlier he escapes from his house and walks the 60 miles from Salem down to Sowams, because he knew the Massasoit from his time in Plymouth. And he asked the Massasoit, where can I go? Where can I establish the town that I want to, a settlement that I want to do? And the Massasoit suggests that he head up to what's now East Providence. But he was not feeling well, having traveled those 60 miles in one of the worst winters recorded at that time. So he stops at a place called Margarets Cave. And I'm going to do my video here. Anybody been to Margaret's Cave? Anybody heard of Margaret's Cave? Well, you haven't been there because it's on private property, though the Williams family has put a little marker there, and it's not really a cave. It's more like it's at the end of a large rock outcropping, but you could lean some logs up against it and make a crude shelter there. Margaret, we believe, was a native woman who the Massasoit assigned the task of nurturing Williams, who was a great friend of native people. I mean, there was a lot of love between them. So he stayed there for 14 weeks, approximately, as his own description goes. And the Massasoit suggests he go up along the Seekonk River, just across the river from Providence today, and sets up a small settlement on Omega Pond, plants his crops, only to find out that the governor in Plymouth says, nope, you got to leave. You're on our territory. So he removed from that area, and if you're from Providence, everybody knows the story. He and his followers go across the river and are greeted by the Narragansett chief and Canonicus, and with what cheer, Neetop, which is kind of a combination of English and the Algonquin language. He arrives over here at Omega Pond, which you can see today, and there is a marker, though it's practically invisible from the street, and it talks about the spring that he established there. You can still see a couple of 17th century houses nearby in East Providence, which, if you're familiar with how things changed there, this place was in 2 towns and 2 states within 100 years. This was Rehoboth, the Rehoboth territory, but at the time it was not when Williams landed there in 1636. The best place to learn about Roger is down at the National Roger Williams Memorial on North Main Street in Providence. It's worth a visit. It's not a big place there, but they have a good display. And if you got a chance to talk with the park ranger, John McNiff, he is Mr. Roger Williams. He probably knows more than anybody about him and his life, and he'd be happy to talk with you. I do, by the way, a 17th century Rhode Island meetup group, and I've got John scheduled for June 20th. So you get on 17th century meetup and you'll find that program and you can sign up. This is what Providence looked like about 1650. And since you're probably not all that familiar with Providence, I won't point out all the details of where the State House is and where they do water fire now. But up in the top there is Pokanoket Hill. Remember I told you that's where the 4 tribes met. So that's just on the outskirts of Providence. There's also a bridge there. Doesn't look like it's from 1680, but that was where the first bridge that formed Providence was built. And guess who the toll taker was? Roger Williams. You got to make a living somehow. So that's the 8th bridge that was there, and I lead tours down there. It's a lot of fun. If you also follow the whole evolution here of land transfers, of state lines, it's a mess. Okay. Basically, these were various purchases, okay, and overlapping jurisdictions, if you will, which finally resulted in this very strange line here from 1747, which is why Warren is always shown as 1747, but it actually had become a town even before that as part of Swansea. The one town that didn't ever change was Bristol, which is that lower peninsula, because that was native land until after the King Philip War. But if you want to get into all this, it's quite a fascinating history, and I have a hard time keeping up with all of it. There in East Providence, which was Rehoboth to start, a tract of either 8 by 8 or 10 by 10 miles, depending on who you read. The Newman Church was established in 1643. by, of course, Newman, who had come over from England and was part of the separatist movement, if you will, out of Weymouth, and brought believers with him. You can still see some of those grave sites right across from the church. Not far from there is Hunt's Mills on the 10 Mile River. If you know anything about the establishment of Rumford and that part of East Providence, you'll recognize the 10 Mile River, which kind of draws a big circle around a good portion of what was known as the Ring of the Green. So everybody had a front door, if you will, to their property on the green, which was quite large, and then their back door was on one of the rivers there, including the Seekonk River. So not bad for first property. Of course, every one of those houses would burn in the King Philip War, so you really can't find any existing houses. But the mills along the 10 Mile River are still celebrated at Hunt's Mills, which is the East Providence Historical Society land, and is an opportunity to understand the growth of those, that early industrial period that started in mid-17th century. A few miles from there, up in what is still Rehoboth, that other part, Rehoboth gets divided first into Seekonk and then again into East Providence, Seekonk, and Rehoboth. But in Rehoboth, if you wander through those narrow roads through the woods, you will come across a little settlement that also had a mill there. There's a couple of markers, including one for these blockhouses that were set up as garrisons during attacks during the King Philip War. There are none in existence, but the town is doing what they can to at least mark those areas. King Philip War, I could be here for the rest of the day talking about the King Philip War. Relax, I'm not going to. This was essentially a product of colonial settlement all around the Bristol Peninsular Cosumbat Neck, and Mount Hope, which you may have heard of, was the home of King Philip. That's still there and still not developed, so you can go to the seat there if you go to Mount Hope Farm and ask for permission. But you can at least begin to see all those little yellow areas there were surrounding the native settlements that remain down here in what is today Bristol. The population, we believe, from the early 1700s of the native people living there was about 7,000. By the time of the King Philip War, it was about 700. That had to do with everything from more disease outbreaks. There was one in 1633 and another one after that. But I attribute it more to simply the stress of colonization. These are people who had lived their own way for 10,000 years, and now the English were imposing their way on them. Though there was cooperation and there are various points of view in terms of whether this was mutual or not, but it became clearer and clearer after the Massasoit's death in 60-61 that the relationship that had been established for those first 40 years was beginning to go south. And you can read the story of John Sassamon and his death and the trial, et cetera, all kinds of reasons why that war happened. But it happened at a point when the native population was basically saying, if we don't do this, if we don't have this war and essentially drive the English back to where they came from, we will be gone. It won't be long. So the war breaks out. Again, I won't go into the details of that. Most of you probably know a good deal about it. And it swept west, and then we believe the attempt was going to be to move east because their allies were in the west. And they could very well, there was a point in the early 76 when it didn't look very good for the colonists. And some of them were already going back to England at that point. But the English began under Church to start using the same tactics that King Philip had used, more guerrilla-style fighting, got the upper hand. John Alderman, who was a Native American himself, ends up, because Church's gun misfired, shoots King Philip and in the miry swamp in Bristol, and there's a marker for that. And again, the long history of those who weren't killed were enslaved or moved out of the area. And the so-called disappearance of Native people, not true, but that's what everybody thought or wanted. So let me just finish here with some of the places that you can go and visit. This is the Garrison, the marker for the Garrison house, very close to where the war broke out. It's still there, and you can find it by going to the SowamsHeritageArea.org website. All of this is described there, lots of pictures, Google Maps to get you there, etc. Antowain Rock, where the final battle, if you will, of when Church, already having killed King Philip, confronts Antowain, his lieutenant, and captures him, doesn't kill him, but he's sent to Plymouth, and his head's cut off there. So, various places. I love ancient Little Rock Cemetery, Little Neck Cemetery in East Providence. Is the location where Elizabeth Tilley is buried, and it's a wonderful story because she came over from England as a little girl, lost her parents, et cetera, marries, and ends up going through the King Philip War and dies after that. And we think she's the only person who has that trajectory, having come from England, going through the war, and surviving, and dies there. John Miles is buried there, as are a number of people in different cemeteries around there. Again, it's all detailed on the website. I've looked at all the evidence of the 17th century in this area. I find lots of natural areas, some of the farms that haven't changed in that 400 years. This one in Warren was a King's Grant farm. It's still in operation, and we're working with the owner there on this. I work with the land conservation folks, and to reveal places that you can go and find what it might have been like at the time. Now, I'll get to some questions in just a minute. Wonderful places like King's Rock that no one had discovered, that we found that thousands of people drive by every day and know nothing about, and what I believe to be a perched or balanced rock right across the street from that, a Native American site. Again, no documentation. This is my conjecture. And Abrams Rock, and here's King Philip's Seat that you can still go to, and here's the meeting place on New Pokanoket Hill. Bristol, after the war, was laid out, and it's a wonderful town, but not much left of the 17th century, other than a few houses. First house ever built in Bristol, up there on the upper right, it's right on the main street on the way into town. It's apartment houses now, unfortunately not restored, but that house the wood was brought over from England to build that. And then the first church that was built there, and this is what that place looked like in about 1906. It's called Silver Spring. And artifacts in the church that were brought over from England again, and the burial site. You can see all that when you get on the website and go visit. Here's the other two 17th century houses in Bristol. That's it. They're just three houses left from the 17th century there. And then the other 17th century houses are all detailed on the website. You can drive by them. The only one that's open is the Martin House in Swansea, and they do tours in July and August on Sunday afternoons. Back to where we started. This is the Osamequin Memorial that's in Burrs Hill, and that's the vault that they buried, and they had a celebration there. And I work with the Pokanoket Tribe primarily because they are the people who were there. I don't know if anybody here is Mashpee, but they didn't start till 1833, and they were not in the war. And there's some contention among tribes as to who's really descended from Massasoit. But this guy right here is our Sagamore. Bill Guy, lives in Barrington, and we're doing a presentation next Thursday night. I'll be with him up at the rededication of the King Philip seat, and we're just about out of time. So if you want to find out more, go to Sowams Heritage Area. You can go on your phone. You can find a map. Click on any of those locations. It'll take you directly to those pages. So I think I'm done. All right. Thank you very much.